Every empire in history has had one thing in common. It controlled the thing the world needed most. Rome controlled grain routes, Britain controlled sea lanes, America controlled oil. And today, in 2026, the thing the world needs most is something most people have never held in their hands. A semiconductor chip, smaller than a fingernail, found in every smartphone, every car, every missile, every AI server on the planet. For 4 decades, only a handful of countries knew how to make them, and they used that knowledge like a weapon. China spent 30 years and hundreds of billions trying to crack it. They haven't. Not fully. And while the world was watching China struggle, India just made a move that almost nobody saw coming. India's two pillars, the Silicon move and the deep-sea gamble. There's a concept every serious geopolitician understands but rarely speaks about plainly. Strategic vulnerability. It means this. If you depend on another country for something your nation cannot survive without food, fuel, chips, weapons, then you are not truly sovereign. You are, at best, a very polite hostage. India has known this for a long time. In 2022, when the global semiconductor shortage hit, Indian factories making cars, phones, and appliances found themselves stuck waiting for chips that never came, from factories they didn't own, in countries they had no leverage over. The same year when Russia invaded Ukraine, global oil prices exploded. India, which imports more than 85% of its oil, saw fuel prices spike across the board. Inflation crept into kitchens, cooking gas, diesel, kerosene, two crises, two weaknesses, both rooted in the same problem. India was dependent on chips it didn't make, on oil it didn't drill. And in the 21st century, dependence is not just an economic problem, it is a security threat. So India decided to act, not in one move, but in two almost simultaneously. The first pillar, semiconductors. The second pillar, energy. This is the story of both. Pillar 1, the Silicon move. To understand why what happened in the Netherlands on May 16, 2026 was so significant, one needs to understand what a semiconductor chip is and why it's so brutally difficult to make. A modern processor contains billions of transistors on a piece of silicon the size of a thumbnail. These transistors are measured in nanometers, 1/1000th of a meter. The latest chips from Taiwan's TSMC operate at 3 nanometers. A strand of human DNA is about 2.5 nanometers wide. Etching patterns at that scale requires one of the most complex machines ever built. It is called a lithography machine. Think of it as an extraordinarily precise printer for circuits. It uses extreme ultraviolet light radiation that doesn't exist naturally on Earth's surface to trace circuit patterns onto silicon wafers with atomic precision. Only one company in the world manufactures these EUV machines at scale, ASML, based in Veldhoven, the Netherlands. A single machine costs approximately 200 million US dollars. It contains over 100,000 parts sourced from 5,000 suppliers across 16 countries. Without ASML's machines, there are no advanced chips, no AI, no chips, no smartphones, no chips, no guided missiles. ASML is, quietly, one of the most strategically important companies on Earth. In 2019, the United States placed ASML at the center of one of the most effective economic weapons in modern history. Washington used its influence and the fact that ASML's supply chain runs through American allied nations to block ASML from exporting its EUV machines to China. The logic was simple. No EUV lithography means no advanced chips. No advanced chips means no cutting-edge AI, no next-generation weapons, no 21st century power. China launched the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, pouring hundreds of billions of yuan into building its own lithography capability. As of 2026, they have not succeeded. SMIC, China's best chip maker, has managed some 7-nanometer chips, but inconsistently, slowly, and without EUV. The chip war between America and China is fundamentally a war over who controls ASML's technology. For years, India sat outside all of this. Not as a player, as a spectator. That changed in The Hague. On May 16, 2026, Prime Minister Modi traveled to The Hague for a bilateral summit with Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof. The agenda covered trade, defense, and strategic technology, but the headline was a document signed in a conference room between two corporate delegations. Tata Electronics and ASML signed a memorandum of understanding to establish a strategic partnership for India's semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. Under the agreement, ASML will deploy its full suite of lithography tools and solutions at Tata Electronics' upcoming 300mm fab in Dholera, Gujarat. ASML will not just supply the machines, it will help set them up, operate them, transfer knowledge to local engineers, co-develop R&D infrastructure, and build a resilient domestic supply chain. Dr. Randhir Thakur, CEO of Tata Electronics, called it a foundational partnership, one that brings the highest global standards of quality and manufacturing excellence to Indian soil for the first time. ASML's CEO Christophe Fouquet said India's expanding semiconductor sector represents compelling opportunities and that ASML is committed to long-term partnerships in the region. In diplomatic language, that is about as strong a statement of commitment as it gets. What made the moment even more striking was the context. Just days earlier, high-level U.S.-China talks in Beijing had stalled, with both sides trading accusations and leaving with nothing signed. While two superpowers fumbled their diplomacy, India quietly walked away from the Netherlands with a deal that China has been trying and failing to secure for years. Dholera is a special investment region located approximately 100 kilometers southwest of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, a greenfield development built on undeveloped land near the Gulf of Khambat. Tata Electronics is constructing India's first commercial 300mm semiconductor fab there. Total planned investment, 11 billion US dollars, roughly 91,000 crore rupees. The fab will manufacture across nodes, 28 nanometers, 40 nanometers, 55 nanometers, 90 nanometers, and 110 nanometers. These are not the most cutting-edge chips. The frontier is 3 nanometers, but they are the workhorses of the global chip economy. Cars, industrial equipment, consumer electronics, power systems. The automotive sector alone depends almost entirely on chips at 28 nanometers and above. When the chip shortage hit between 2020 and 2022, it wasn't a shortage of 3 nanometer chips. It was a shortage of exactly the kind Dholera will make. India is positioning itself to supply the exact segment the world keeps running short of. Before the ASML deal, Tata had already signed with PSMC Powerchip Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, one of Taiwan's major foundries, which committed to bringing process technology, manufacturing knowledge, and engineering expertise to Dholera. Taiwan is historically protective of its semiconductor IP. A country that manufactures over 60% of the world's chips doesn't share its secrets easily. The PSMC deal alone was historic. But here's the thing. PSMC tells you how to make chips. ASML makes the machine that actually manufactures them. A fab without lithography equipment is like a printing press without the press. You can know every secret of the newspaper business, but if you don't have the machine, you are not printing newspapers. India now has both. Process knowledge from PSMC and manufacturing equipment from ASML. This is the complete picture. This is why May 16, 2026 was different. There is a reason the signing happened at a heads of government meeting, not in a corporate boardroom. When a country signs a semiconductor deal at the prime ministerial level, with cameras rolling and official press statements, it is not just doing business. It is sending a signal. To China, India now has access to the same technology Washington denied Beijing. The gap America used to pressure China is now in part accessible to India, a rising power and direct competitor across multiple domains. To the United States, India is integrating into the trusted supply chain. Washington has been pushing allied nations to diversify chip production away from Taiwan and China. India's Dholera fab is exactly what Washington wants to see. To global chip buyers, automakers, electronics firms, AI operators, India is open for business, a geopolitically stable source of mature node chips outside Taiwan and China is being built. And to Indians, the era of importing what the world's most powerful nations manufacture is slowly ending. India's semiconductor import bill is growing fast. In 2022 to 23, India spent approximately 5.6 billion US dollars importing chips. That figure is projected to cross $80 billion per year by 2030 as the country's electronics and digital economy expands. Every rupee flows out into Taiwan, South Korea, the United States, China instead of building capacity and jobs at home. And foundational investments are exactly how industrial revolutions begin. South Korea was not born with Samsung. Taiwan was not born with TSMC. Both made long, expensive bets on semiconductor capability, and those bets transformed developing economies into technology powerhouses. India is making its first serious bet. Any honest account must acknowledge the risks. Chip fabs are extraordinarily difficult to build and operate. Yield the percentage of chips on a wafer that actually work takes years to optimize. India has no prior experience operating a 300 mm fab. It will start from scratch, relying on knowledge transferred by PSMC and ASML. That process is possible, but it is not fast and not cheap. Infrastructure is another challenge. Advanced manufacturing requires ultra-pure water, ultra-stable power, and vibration-free foundations. Dholera, as a greenfield site, needs all of this proven reliable before quality chips can be produced. Then there is talent. A 300 mm fab requires thousands of specialized engineers, process, equipment, quality, yield. India's talent pool is vast, but chip manufacturing skills are narrow and globally scarce. None of this diminishes what India has done. It simply makes the road ahead clearer. The move in The Hague was the commitment. The hard work begins in Dholera. Pillar 2. The deep sea gamble. Here is a number that does not get enough attention. India imports more than 85% of the crude oil it consumes. 85%. India is the world's third largest oil importer, and that position comes with a price measured not just in dollars and rupees, but in strategic vulnerability. Every time there is a conflict in the Middle East, every time OPEC cuts production, every time tanker routes through the Strait of Hormuz become uncertain, India bleeds. The Russia-Ukraine war illustrated this vividly. When Western nations sanctioned Russian energy in 2022, Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. Petrol rose. LPG cylinders became expensive for millions. Inflation spread from fuel into food, from food into transport, into every sector. India managed partly by sharply increasing imports of discounted Russian crude, which created a different dependency. But managing a crisis is not the same as solving it. The structural vulnerability remained. India was burning energy it didn't produce, from reserves it didn't own, through routes it couldn't control. And a strategic question was always waiting. What happens if the imports stop not for weeks, but permanently? In Hindu mythology, Samudra Manthan is the churning of the cosmic ocean, a great effort between gods and demons to extract Amrit, the nectar of immortality, from the depths of the sea. India's government chose this name deliberately for its flagship offshore energy initiative. The message is embedded in the myth. The answer lies beneath the ocean. The effort required is immense. The prize, if achieved, transforms everything. India has a substantial offshore hydrocarbon resource base. Its exclusive economic zone spans 2.37 million square kilometers, stretching into the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean. Geological surveys suggest significant untapped reserves in deepwater and ultra-deepwater fields, where drilling has historically been too expensive or technically out of reach. Samudra Manthan is India's attempt to change that. It is a national program to develop offshore energy at scale through deepwater drilling, offshore platform construction, subsea pipelines, and a domestic oil and gas engineering ecosystem that does not yet exist at the required scale. India's offshore sedimentary basins cover roughly 1.35 million square kilometers, a maritime estate the country has barely explored. The Krishna Godavari Basin on the east coast, where Reliance Industries operates the KGD6 field, is one of India's most promising deepwater areas, estimated to hold several trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves, only a fraction developed. The Andaman-Nicobar Basin, the Kutch offshore area, the Mumbai High Deepwater Extension, and the Mahanadi Basin are all considered prospective zones receiving limited exploration relative to their potential. The reason is simple. Deep water drilling is brutally expensive. A rig capable of operating beyond 1,500 meters costs between 200,000 and 600,000 US dollars per day. A single exploration well can cost $100 million with no guarantee of finding commercial oil or gas. India's state oil companies, primarily ONGC, have historically lacked the capital, technology, and risk appetite for aggressive deepwater exploration. Samudra Manthan is designed to change the economics of that equation. For the first time, the government is actively incentivizing private and foreign participation in deepwater exploration, offering revenue-sharing contracts, faster environmental clearances, and dedicated infrastructure support. The goal is to make India's offshore blocks commercially attractive to the same international energy majors currently investing in comparable waters off Brazil, Mozambique, and Guyana. At the heart of the initiative is a plan to develop large-scale offshore drilling capability, including mega-rig projects to unlock India's deepwater potential. The strategy has three components. First, building a domestic fleet of drilling rigs. India has historically relied on foreign rig contractors, expensive, slow, gone when the work is done. Domestic capacity changes the equation. Second, developing subsea infrastructure, wellheads on the ocean floor, flow lines, risers carrying oil to surface platforms. This requires specialized engineering and vessels India is working to build domestically. Third, building the onshore supply chain. Platforms need constant maintenance, resupply, and staffing requiring supply bases, maintenance facilities, helicopter services, and engineering support. India's existing offshore infrastructure, centered on Mumbai, needs major expansion. The goal is not just to drill more wells, it is to build an integrated, self-sufficient offshore energy industry that India owns and operates. Consider India's oil import geography. Roughly 60% of crude imports come from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait traveling through the Arabian Sea to West Coast refineries. More comes from Russia and Africa through the Indian Ocean and Red Sea. Every route passes through critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Malacca. In a serious conflict, any of these could be threatened by a hostile naval power, by insurgents, or by a great power blockade. An India that produces even 30 or 40% of its own oil from wells in its own exclusive economic zone, via rigs it owns, through pipelines it controls, is a fundamentally more resilient country. Not invulnerable, not energy independent, but less exposed, less stoppable. That is why India calls this not just an energy program. It calls it a sovereignty initiative. In 2022 to 23, India's crude oil import bill crossed 160 billion US dollars, mostly foreign exchange flowing out of the economy every year to pay for fuel. India's entire goods export revenue that year was approximately $450 billion. The country spent more than a third of its export earnings on crude oil alone. Every dollar of domestically produced oil that replaces an imported barrel stays in India, paying Indian workers, funding Indian companies, building technical capability within Indian institutions. The multiplier effect of domestic energy production is enormous. A national offshore program at Samudra Manthan's scale could reduce India's energy import bill by tens of billions over the next decade, freeing foreign exchange for productive investment, stabilizing the rupee, and building a world-class domestic energy engineering sector. This is not just about pumping oil. This is about building the industrial capabilities of a rising power. Like the semiconductor story, the offshore energy story comes with real risks. Deep water geology is unforgiving. Not every promising basin contains commercial reserves. For every KGD6 success, there are multiple campaigns that return nothing. The risk of expensive dry wells is real. Environmental concerns are legitimate. Deepwater drilling carries the risk of catastrophic blowouts. The Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010 released 4.9 million barrels into the Gulf of Mexico over 87 days. India's program must be paired with world-class safety management, particularly near ecologically sensitive areas like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Capital requirements are immense. Attracting investment requires stable regulatory frameworks, transparent contracting, and competitive fiscal terms. Areas where India has not always performed consistently. These challenges are surmountable, but they require sustained commitment, patient capital, and consistent policy, not short-term thinking. Step back from the individual stories. The ASML deal in The Hague, the deep water platforms in the Arabian Sea, and a larger architecture becomes visible. India is simultaneously addressing its two most critical structural vulnerabilities: building domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity, reducing chip dependence, aligning with the global trusted supply chain, positioning as an alternative to Taiwan and China, building domestic energy production capacity, reducing hydrocarbon import dependence, decreasing foreign exchange outflows, hardening its strategic position against the energy coercion wielded against nations from Japan to Germany throughout modern history. These are not coincidences. They are components of a coherent strategic vision. Chips and oil are not the only inputs to national power, but they are the two most fungible. The resources whose presence or absence determines whether a country can produce advanced goods, power its cities, and defend its borders. A country that cannot make chips cannot build the weapons or AI capabilities of the future. A country that cannot produce energy cannot power the factories or data centers of the future. India is working on both. At the same time, at scale. History offers a template for what India is attempting. South Korea in the 1970s and 1980s made state-directed bets on industries it didn't yet own: steel, shipbuilding, automotive, and eventually semiconductors. Samsung didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the product of government-backed industrial policy, patient capital, and national commitment. Today, South Korea is the second-largest semiconductor manufacturing nation on Earth. A country of 52 million people punches above its weight because it made the right bets at the right moment. Japan rebuilt from the ashes of 1945 by systematically acquiring technology and creating globally competitive industries. China's economic miracle was built on the same principle: identify next-era industries, mobilize capital, attract foreign technology, build domestic capability over decades. India is watching all of these lessons and drawing its own conclusions. The Dholera fab and Samudra Manthan are not random acts of policy. They are the beginning of a long national project to move from being a country that buys the world's most important things to a country that makes them. There is one more dimension: India's position in the great power competition between the United States and China. India has been deliberate about not taking sides, a posture called strategic autonomy in Indian foreign policy circles. But strategic autonomy is not neutrality. It is the capacity to make independent choices, to trade with whoever offers the best terms, to align on whatever basis serves the national interest, and to refuse the false choice between becoming Washington's junior partner or Beijing's subordinate. To exercise genuine strategic autonomy, a country must have leverage, and leverage comes from capability. An India that makes its own chips is not dependent on Taiwan's goodwill or America's export licenses. An India that produces its own oil is not exposed to the energy diplomacy Russia or Saudi Arabia exercise over dependent nations. These two pillars don't make India a superpower overnight, but they move it meaningfully closer to the sovereign economic agency that allows 1.4 billion people to determine their own future, rather than having it determined in Beijing, Washington, Riyadh, or Taipei. That is what is being built in Dholera. That is what is rising in the deep waters of the Arabian Sea, quietly, deliberately, brick by brick and chip by chip. Nations are not built in news cycles. They are built in decades, in the patient accumulation of capability, the compounding of investment, the slow development of human expertise, and the gradual shift from dependence to self-reliance. What India announced in The Hague, and what it is pursuing beneath the waters of its maritime zone through Samudra Manthan will not deliver full results in the next budget cycle, the next election, or even the next 5 years. But in 10 years, perhaps 15, if the Dholera fab is producing chips at scale, if ONGC is pulling meaningful volumes of oil from Indian deepwater fields, if thousands of Indian engineers have been trained in lithography and subsea production, the strategic landscape will look different. India will be a country that makes things the world needs, not a country that imports them. The transition from consumer to producer in any strategic sector is never easy, never fast, and never guaranteed. But it has to start somewhere. It started in The Hague on May 16, 2026, and it is happening right now, in the red earth of Dholera and the deep blue water of the Arabian Sea. Two industries, two bets, one direction, toward a future where India is not a country that waits for the world to supply it, but a country the world comes to. There is a tendency, understandable, to be skeptical of India's big announcements. The country has a long history of ambitious plans that move slowly, projects that took twice as long and cost 3 times as much, reforms announced with fanfare and implemented with friction. That skepticism is earned, and it should not be suspended. The Dholera fab will face delays. The offshore fields will have dry wells. The chip market will cycle through booms and busts. Oil prices will be volatile. Policy will be inconsistent in places. All of that is true, and none of it changes the fundamental importance of what is being attempted, because the alternative, continuing to depend on foreign chips and foreign oil indefinitely as the 21st century's great power competition intensifies, is not stability, it is strategic exposure. The world India is entering rewards countries that built their capabilities early, where technology leadership determines military advantage, where energy access determines economic resilience, where making critical things determines diplomatic leverage. India is building. That is the story. Not finished, not guaranteed. Building, and in a world where the next decade will be defined by who controls the technologies that power everything, the chips in every device, the energy in every engine. Being a builder is the only position that matters.